Hi everyone, Rusty here. Last video we talked about color harmony. Today we are going to shift gears and discuss the concept of contrast. I've briefly talked about this before in a previous video, but now we will go a little bit deeper. We'll talk about 3 ways we can add contrast to our model, and each idea will be its own video. So today we'll just focus on one concept at a time. Now we have this Zaku 1 here who has kindly volunteered to be our model for this 3-part series. I worked on him some time ago, and looking back now, there are quite a few areas that need corrections. So I'm going to try and be as critical as I can and then come up with solutions to address the issues. I think it's helpful for us to look back on our old models and see how we can approach them differently, especially after some time has passed. Often if we stare at the same model for too long, we become blind to the flaws, especially if we put a lot of emotional and time investment into the kit. So let's bring out a few photos and see how our friend here first started out. If we look at the blue armor parts here, we can see that the value of the blue remains mostly uniform throughout the model. Now, before we move on, because I don't really have an art background, there may be certain terminology that I might use incorrectly. So for those who are better informed about this subject, please comment any inaccuracies I may have made, and we can all learn together. So what is this value that I speak of? In art, value refers to how bright or dark a color is. And value can be expressed as a number from 1 to 9, 1 being the lightest and 9 being the darkest. Though of course there are many scales out there, so it doesn't have to be 9. It can be 1 to 5 for simpler scales, or 1 to 50 if you want. It's a spectrum, and you can always use Google to find a scale you prefer. Anyway, for the purposes of this video, let's stick with 1 to 9. Pause the video here and try and judge for yourself. If this image was in a grayscale, then what number or range of numbers would you give this blue armor section in terms of its brightness? Again, 1 being the lightest and 9 being the darkest. Right, if you had a chance to do that, then let's compare notes. I'd say it's a pretty narrow range. I'm thinking maybe 3 to 5 here. It doesn't really matter what the exact numbers are, as long as we both share the same insight that for this particular image, the value range is narrow. And that's the first issue I need to resolve. If we don't have a broad range of value here, then it limits the contrast of our weathering effects later on. And what do I mean by this? Now let's return to the image with its original colors. Yes, we can make out some light and dark streaks, but this is a close-up image. From a distance, you won't really be able to see much of it. In other words, our viewer has to work hard to appreciate the effect. And usually I want the opposite. I want the viewer to have a relaxing time. They walk past the display table and at a glance see something interesting in my work. Then they're enticed and they step a little bit closer, and then they get rewarded with the details. Of course, value is just one way to catch the viewer's eye. You can pose your model in an interesting way, maybe use an uncommon color scheme, maybe you have a large work with shelf presence, and the list goes on. So value cannot work on its own to draw attention, but it is important to help your work become more eye-catching. So now we know what the problem is, what's the solution? So here's my suggestion. Let's expand the range of light to dark. Originally, I estimated the value range to be between 3 to 5, right? So I want to go for at least 3 for the brightest and 8 for the darkest. Now why not go for the whole spectrum 1 to 9? Maximize the contrast. Why shouldn't we do that? Well, if we assume 1 is pure white and 9 is pure black, then chances are I don't think such an extreme value range will be realistic, because not many things are pure white or black. Even if you think say your car tire is black, it's probably sitting around the 7 or 8 on that scale. So let's rule out 1 and 9. Now, given that blue is a rather dark color intrinsically anyway, if we lighten it too much, it may no longer read as blue. So I'll rule out 2 as well, leaving 3 as the brightest that I'll go for. And for similar reasons, we can darken the blue down to an 8. So the value range of 3 to 8 will be a total of 5 to 6 tones that I'll be mixing and blending, which will be a good amount of variety. What about green, for example? We can use a similar reasoning and keep the value range within 4 to 8. Why not choose 3 to 8 like the blue parts? Later on you see that I used yellow to lighten the green tones. And that's because I didn't want to desaturate the green too much with white. So I stopped around 4. But for the blue parts, I chose to use more white to lighten it, compromising on its saturation. The compensation I get for that, though, is a greater range of values. Now, to avoid using numbers for the rest of the video, let's just use more relatable terms instead. The terms I've chosen here are purely arbitrary because different people may use them in their own way, but I feel words generally give more meaning than numbers. So when I say shadow, I'm referring to a value of about 8. I use dark base to refer to a value of 7, mid-tone for a value of 6, light base for 5, highlight for 3 to 4. Now, how do I position the highlight and shadows? There are 3 different types of lighting effect that you can choose. Zenithal lighting is quite common for scale models. This usually assumes one light source directly overhead, so your highlights are usually concentrated around the top of the head and shoulders of your gunpla, while dark base and shadow are more prevalent around the legs and feet. This is just like seeing a sculpture in a museum, for example. Panel lighting is also quite common. It's often seen in your out-of-box real-grade Gundam. You can have 3 to 4 tones of the same color, but only one tone is used for one armor panel. There's not much of a gradient for this style, but you can still enhance visual interest when you combine this with zenithal lighting, for example. Meaning to say you place all the light tones on panels that face up and dark tones on panels facing toward the ground. Anyway, there's one more lighting effect, which I use for this Zaku one, and that is color modulation, which really just means using highlight and shadow to simulate how light interacts with a model. This can have different interpretations, though this style commonly assumes multiple light sources. My take on color modulation in this case also borrows from zenithal lighting, in that I put all my highlights closer to the top of each armor plate and shadows closer to the bottom. But by having individual light sources for each armor plate as well, you get the same range of values whether you're looking at the head or the feet, front or the back. This helps to make the model more interesting no matter which direction it is viewed from. Sometimes I also deliberately flip the orientation of the highlight and shadow, like you can see here in the feet, just so that there's better contrast between the shadow and highlight of the adjacent armor plate. Perhaps this can be considered rather unrealistic, but I can accept it if it means having a more eye-catching result. You don't necessarily need to have light coming from one edge and finish off in the opposite end like what I've done here. If you look at this left shoulder armor plate, I position the light source in the middle, which is a bit different from the rest of the model. In fact, some people like having the highlight in the middle, gradually transitioning to shadows going out to the edges for each panel. Does this type of color modulation sound familiar? Some of you may already be going, well, that's the same as pre-shading, isn't it? Well, pre-shading is a name given to a certain method, though not the actual lighting effect itself. I'm not sure if there's a consensus on this, but I think when gunpla modelers perform pre-shading, they spray a dark base around the edges of the model and the base color and highlight closer to the center of an armor panel, creating the gradient effect. Maybe this might be a good idea for a future video, so I can show you how to do this with a paintbrush. Anyway, as I mentioned, not everyone may interpret pre-shading the same way I do. So this would be a good time for you to comment on what your understanding of pre-shading is, so we can get a discussion going in the comment section and I don't mislead people out there with my limited knowledge. Now, coming back to this model, I'm not too worried about the base coat appearing too exaggerated when painting in this color modulation style, because the subsequent weathering process will dull down the overall effect. For those areas that appear too dark, I'll just add more light colored weathering effects. And the opposite is also true. If I think an area has too much highlight, I'll add some dark chipping or streaks to bring down that brightness. You can think of it this way. The highlight areas are like a canvas for your dark streaks and chips, and the shadow areas will contain the light streaks and chips. All that being said, it's not a hard and fast rule, because you need a mixture of both light and dark weathering effects, since it would be very weird to have only dark chipping on one side of the armor and light chipping on the opposite side. The key here is deciding which weathering effect to prioritize so you can bring balance back to the model. Anyway, why is value so important? That's because contrast in value is what enables the viewer to understand the model. Human beings like variety, but what they love is what they understand. Maybe it's a biology or psychology thing, I'm not too sure, but people tend to be afraid of what they don't understand. If you can provide enough visual cues to the viewer to inform them where the armor starts and ends and how the armor curves around, then that's half the battle won. In the human eye, there are two types of photoreceptor cells. One type is sensitive to color, and the other is meant for light. Now guess what? There are way more receptors meant for light perception than for color. So I think it isn't a coincidence that we are wired to understand the world around us based on light and shadow. Look at your favorite Gundam artwork and dial down the color, and it looks interesting even in grayscale. Now take that same artwork and overexpose the image. Now it becomes much more difficult to appreciate or make sense of it. If you're a beginner, don't worry about color too much. Think in terms of balancing light and dark, and you'll get a more striking result. Right, that pretty much wraps up this first idea of contrast using value. To summarize, value is about brightness, and you can generate interest by placing highlight and shadows next to each other on adjacent armor plates. There are different kinds of lighting effect that you can choose. If you're new to this, just pick one and stick to it for one model. Then experiment between different effects, and you will find one that you naturally gravitate to. Think about this concept of value during the base coat as well as the weathering phase to get a balanced result. Now for our next video, which is the second part of this series, we will discuss about utilizing the principle of contrast in a different way. I've mentioned briefly that I used certain colors to lighten or darken our main blue or green color before, but I didn't explain why I chose those colors. This brings me to a whole other topic altogether, so it deserves its own video. However, I'm sure you'll find information from both videos helpful as they are closely related. Anyway, I'll see you guys on the next one. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.